Hello and welcome back to the Live Global Relief podcast. Today I'm here with Daniel to discuss women's rights in the Middle East. Welcome to the podcast, Daniel. How are you today?
Thank you so much. I'm good. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Thank you
How
for
are
being
you?
here. I'm good, thank you.
Good.
Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself, what you study, where you're from?
Sure, yeah. I'm from London, but I normally study medicine in Bristol. But with medical degrees, there's a thing called intercalation where you can just sort of take a year out and just like cram another degree into like a year. So I'm in Liverpool doing a master's in psychology.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. Thank you. And today we're going to be talking about women's rights in the Middle East. Is there anything particular that's made you interested in that topic, that's made you want to be more knowledgeable about it?
I think it's just there's a lot of I don't know. I mean, I try not to spend too much time on social media now. When you go online, there's lots of there's quite a lot of toxicity and quite a lot of hate, I think. And I think as someone doing psychology, I'm kind of interested in where that comes from, but I'm also interested in what that looks like outside the West.
Yeah,
And just sort of, especially in different cultural regions of the world where the backdrop is so different and all these issues of misogyny and patriarchy are, they haven't, I mean, it's not just that they haven't gone away, they're stronger than they are in the West. But I just think it's very important to know what kind of forms they take and to just
yeah,
sort of gain some perspective.
yeah, that makes sense. So, if you can, do you want to give a bit of like an overview of what the state of women's rights looks like right now in the Middle East?
It's not wonderful. There has actually been a lot of really good progress made, especially in the last 5 years. And it is an issue that's getting better, but not fantastic. It's also like quite uneven progress because especially in the Middle East and North Africa region, there's lots of disparities between countries between like the wealthy Gulf states
Yeah,
who are rich with oil and the states who don't have that privilege. And I think the state of women's rights is very different depending on the average levels of wealth and just HDI
yeah.
in these societies.
Can you think of any particular examples of things you've seen, like progress that have been made recently?
Yeah. So in the past 5 years or so, a lot of countries have enacted domestic abuse laws, criminalizing domestic abuse for the first time. I think it's very telling that it took until approximately 2020
Yeah,
for various countries in the Middle East, North Africa region to do that. But I mean, I guess it's still progress, no matter how slow it is. There's also been lots more women going into education, especially in the Gulf states. I know Qatar and the UAE have made quite big strides on that. And there was this kind of landmark case in 2018 in Saudi Arabia where women were finally allowed to drive. There's still lots of progress to be done, and I think most of the research I've done have been about issues with women's rights rather than progress in women's rights,
yeah,
because as fantastic as progress is, and it's really nice to hear about something optimistic and uplifting, I do want to draw attention to existing problems that are
yeah,
still going on rather than progress. But it is important to keep that in
yeah,
mind.
yeah. And what problems did you want to draw attention today?
Well, what I wanted to do actually was I sort of wanted to start by talking about something called the World Value Survey, which talks about how different values in different countries and how that sort of corresponds to the
Yeah,
status of women's rights. Because obviously, societies which have more or less patriarchal or traditional views that will be reflected in different ways in
yeah,
which women are treated. And then I sort of want to run through the legal situation of women in various different countries in the Middle East and North Africa region. Not kind of some of the statistics I have are specific to certain countries, but in general, I want to focus on the whole MENA region. And then I also sort of want to talk about how I think laws and culture are often related. I think the laws that societies act are, in a way, a mirror of the attitudes that societies have. But I also think that oftentimes, despite a law being passed, that doesn't always necessarily mean that a problem's gone away. So,
yes,
for example, I mean, like the late 60s in the West, for example, you had landmark civil rights legislation, but sexism and racism were still very prevalent. And I sort of just wanted to talk about cultural practices in this region, about people's stances on domestic violence, incidence rates of domestic violence, rates of sexual harassment, rates of child marriage and honor killings. And I just sort of want to take these statistics and try and use that to sort of paint a picture of what daily life is probably like for women in these regions. I think I'd also start by saying, I'm aware that I'm a man talking about women's issues, but that's something very important, and I don't at all want to detract experience or take away from the voice of women. But I also think it's a very important issue. I think it's good to raise awareness of it however you can. And I also think it's nice for individuals who aren't part of a marginalized group to speak up for that. I mean, as a
yes,
man in the
yeah,
Middle East, I'd be more privileged than a woman. I am Jewish, so I would actually be screwed either way. But you get my point.
Thank you. So, would you like to start by telling our listeners what the World Values Survey is and how it works and what you've learned from it, for maybe people that aren't familiar with the World Values Survey?
Yes, I would. So the World Value Survey, it's basically, so it started in 1981. And it's just a bunch of researchers going to different countries and asking them loads and loads of questions. Not just stances on social issues like divorce, abortion, euthanasia, suicide, but on more deeper ethical values. For example, the status towards authority, the status to tolerance towards other individuals, levels of trust in society in general, family values, national pride, ethnocentrism. And it's actually a really great, so it's a really great source of information. And I've talked about it a lot before. And these two political scientists, this guy called Robert Inglehart and something Welzel. I tend to remember surnames because they're kind of out there surnames. So Inglehart and Welzel, what they've done is they've made this little graph, and you can look it up online if you are so disposed. It's a 2D graph, basically where every single country is given a dot on this graph, and it's kind of used to map how progressive different countries are. So at the top of the y-axis is traditional versus secular rational values, and at the top of the y-axis is countries with strong secular rational values, as they call it, and the bottom of the y-axis are countries with strong traditional values. So traditional values is stuff like deference to authority, stigma against speaking out against authority, family values, authority in the home, religion and the role of religion in politics, national pride, that kind of stuff. This kind of, where countries lie on that axis, predicts quite well how they think about topics like divorce, euthanasia, abortion, suicide, etc. And on the x-axis of this massive chart, cultural map of the world, they call it, which you can Google search. There's one in 2023, which is a really recent one, which I actually recommend doing because it's quite interesting. On the x-axis, at the bottom of that x-axis, so towards the left-hand side of that graph, are countries which are strong in what they call survival values. And at the top of the x-axis, so on the right, are countries which are strong in self-expression values. And survival values include basically just values oriented towards a high consciousness of the precariousness of survival and physical and economic risk. It's kind of related to intolerance for minority groups. It's related to abstinence from politics and generally taking a less active role. It's related to ethnocentrism and ethnic pride. It's related to actually unhappiness. It correlates quite well. I'm bringing this up because if you look at all these different countries in the world, and you can kind of see that if you plot just a dot for every country in the world, countries tend to be grouped within cultural regions. So for example, at the kind of top right of the graph, the most progressive countries in the world are those such as Germany, Sweden, the Nordic countries in general, Protestant regions in general. It's kind of what the cultural group in which those states belong to, Protestant regions. And then if you look at East Asian states such as Japan, China, Hong Kong, all these dots also tend to be really close together, and that's kind of grouped. The researchers call it as a Confucian bubble. And if you look at the bottom left of that graph, so the least progressive societies in the world, the most traditional, the most survival-oriented, the kind of cultural bubble, the kind of cultural group which they belong to is labeled African Islamic societies. So societies which aren't just Islamic, so can be Christian as well, but either countries where Islam remains a strong influence in politics, and also countries in North Africa, where Islam is a strong influence in politics, and Sub-Saharan Africa, which is both Muslim and Christian, but which still holds very conservative values as a region. And all the countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, or the MENA region, as it's often abbreviated to, fit within this kind of cultural bubble of being very strong in traditional values, very strong in survival values. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think it's a nice way of kind of getting some background information on why the status of women is what it is here. Like why are these laws in place? Why are these various cultural practices that I'm going to be talking about later so common? And it's the most traditional society on that list. So the country that's lowest down in the y-axis is Qatar. The country that's furthest to the left on the x-axis, the most survival-oriented country, is Egypt. And I bring this up because when we talk about the statistics I'm going to mention, Egypt, for example, comes up a lot as one of the worst places to be as a woman. It's got some of the highest incidences of physical, sexual harassment, sexual assault, domestic violence, honor killing. And the reason I bring it up is because this cultural map of the world and the World's Value Survey, all this really matters. Like when we talk about the values that different countries have, traditional values, survival values, when I talk about MENA countries tending to be quite survival and tradition oriented, that really has a strong impact on real things. It impacts the happiness and the harm that people go about in their lives. I'm just bringing it up because it provides a nice sort of contextual understanding to all this I'm going to say, I guess. So yeah, that is the World Values Survey.
Thank you so much. I hope that's helped clear it up for our listeners and for me as well. So we want to talk about some of the statistics that you've been talking about with Egypt and Qatar today.
Yeah, I would love to. I think first I'd like to start by just sort of giving like an overview on rights in the region. And just because, so just to say as like an opening sentence, there is only one country in that entire region, the Middle East and North Africa. Just to define where that is, that region basically stretches from Morocco to Iran inclusive. There's some debate in geopolitics about which countries actually fall under that category.
Yeah.
So if you Google that, sometimes Mauritania, which is kind of in like the top left bit of Africa, it's just south of Morocco, is sometimes included in that. The Western Sahara is often included in that. Sometimes Sudan is included in that. Sometimes, very rarely, Turkey. I'm just bringing that up I just want to give like an idea of where we're actually talking about here. So there's only one country in that entire belt of countries where women have full legal rights in the way men do, and that is Tunisia. And in this country, in Tunisia only, women are given equal inheritance to men. So inheritance laws don't favor men. And also Muslim women are allowed to marry non-Muslim men. But in lots of other countries in the region, women don't have these rights. And when we talk about differences in rights between women and men, it tends not to be stuff about free speech or right to vote, which even very conservative countries like Egypt did enact in the late 1900s. It tends not to be rights to assembly. So, for example, like the right to start a trade union or the right to start a protest group or a political party. In these states in general, just to sort of say, all the MENA countries are either authoritarian regimes or hybrid regimes. So there's this really nice statistic called there's this nice like index called the World Democracy Index. And it basically gives every country a score on how democratic it is from 0 to 10. And all the countries in this region are below 6 approximately. Right. So they're all essentially not democracies. They don't have safe guaranteed political rights. They don't have free and fair elections. They don't have a safe, stable respect for human rights. There's lots of arbitrary use of power, etc., etc. So the discrepancy in rights tends not to manifest in that sector, but rather the discrepancy in rights that you see in the MENA region between women and men tends to be about the right to travel, the right to leave the home, the right to disobey a male guardian, for example, a father or a husband, the right to choose where to work. So just to give some statistics on the right to travel. So from Egypt to Iran and that entire belt of countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, women are not legally allowed to leave their home without their male guardian's consent. So they need their husband's or their father's permission, whoever the male guardian happens to be. In 15 of the Middle East and North Africa countries, women are legally required to live with men, and they're legally required to either obey men, live with them, or get their permission to leave the house. So to work or to travel. And I think not only is that a massive violation of authority, and actually of autonomy. And actually what's really interesting is that for example, you might have had like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like that like pyramid of stuff that people need in order to be happy. I've done a lot of research on happiness, and it's what I'm doing my dissertation on. And what a lot of these rights really amount to is very fundamental violations of what humans need to be happy. Autonomy and liberty are human needs. So even if the Maslow's hierarchy doesn't list that, there's lots and lots of models on happiness just in the literature on psychology. And essentially a consensus in the literature is that people need to be able to be free to do what they need to do and also to leave harmful situations. I think it's very important when we look at the rights of women in the Middle East to conceptualize this in terms of happiness versus harm done. Because actually it all sounds a bit abstract when we talk about legislation, but this has really real consequences on how happy people are and how they live. And also being legally required to live with a man and not being able to leave just leaves people really, really open to abuse. And in fact, I think about 37% of all women in Arab countries have experienced domestic abuse. So Arab countries, the Middle East and North Africa is a geographic region. Arab countries are countries with where the majority ethnic group is that of Arabic. In practice, the two categories overlap quite well. But Iran, despite being part of the Middle East and North Africa, isn't an Arabic country. Somalia is an Arabic country, but it isn't part of the Middle East or North Africa. And then like Mauritania and Sudan are also kind of both counted as Arab countries, but they're not always counted as Middle Eastern countries. So another thing, in Qatar, Jordan, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, if women leave home, so try to escape their home without the consent of the male guardian, they can be arrested or detained or forced to return. Again, leaves you wildly open to abuse because there's nothing you can do about it. And in Algeria, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Kuwait, Women have no right to even have a passport without permission from a male guardian, so they actually can't leave the country. Again, you can imagine the consequence of that and what that might lead to. Custody laws also really massively favor men in all of these countries. Women are often separated from their children, especially women trying to leave men due to reasons of abuse. Divorce, as we kind of talked about earlier, more traditional countries tend to take more negative views on divorce. So divorce is harder for women to obtain and it's less favorable to them. In terms of work, so in the world as a whole, 56% of women in the world are of working age work. In the Middle East and North Africa, that statistic's only 27%. The only country which actually forbids gender discrimination in hiring is Morocco. So the legislation that swept the Western world in the late 60s hasn't penetrated to this region yet. The only country in the Middle East and North Africa which has ruled in favor for equal gender wages is Algeria. So there's lots and lots of progress to be done. And also, if we talk about, again, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what human beings need to be happy, the right to go to work, that forms a really important part of someone's identity. It's a really great chance for people to, and obviously loads of people are stuck in dead-end jobs that they hate, and that is awful. But work can, in an ideal situation, be a chance to pursue skills, pursue talents, develop yourself as a person, gain the much needed social contact that you as a human being need. Like if you're at home working domestically in the house, you're not getting social contact with people, which is really, really damaging. Human beings are social animals. That really messes people up. And obviously if you're working domestically, you're not in complete isolation because you are surrounded by family, male guardians. But diversity and variety and numeracy of relationships is so important, especially when husbands may be abusive, and the statistics of which we'll get into a little bit later. So all this stuff about forbidding women to go out to work and develop their identity and develop their talents and get social contact, again, that's really big. That has really bad consequences. And just some other states on legality. Another thing, a really, really basic thing that people need to be happy is to be safe. They need to have security from violence. And that just is really sadly not a thing in a lot of these countries. So as of 2018, and a few countries that I'm about to list have enacted some laws now, but as of 2018, there were 0 domestic abuse laws in Iraq, Iran, Morocco, Qatar, Egypt, the UAE, Sudan, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Palestine, and Kuwait. This amounts to millions of women who just have 0 protection. So in fact, as of 2018, only 1 in 3 countries in this region had any domestic abuse laws at all. Till 2017, actually, rapists in Tunisia would be pardoned if they married their victim, which sounds really bizarre. That's actually been really common throughout history because there was a law in Deuteronomy stipulating that women should be able to choose for their rapist to marry them in order to provide child support. I have to say the Old Testament is not the most progressive document when it comes to the treatment of women. So take that ostensible justification how you will. And another thing, rape victims across the Middle East, if they're married, can actually be charged with adultery and will have to prove in a court of law that they were raped, which is such a wildly traumatic experience. Not only to not be believed, but to be actively punished. There's actually been lots of instances of Western tourists in the UAE who have been raped and then detained and locked in the UAE and have their passports confiscated because they had to prove it. Only 21% approximately of countries in this region, I say approximately because the data that I'm getting this one is a few years old, actually have sexual harassment in the workplace being illegal. Only 21% of countries in the MENA region have sexual harassment in public places being illegal. Only 11% of countries have sexual harassment in education being illegal. And these rates are actually less than that of sub-Saharan Africa, which is, again, also very much in the bottom left of the world, of the cultural map of the world. It's also part of that cultural bubble of African Islamic society. In terms of domestic abuse, so only 26% of countries in the Middle East and North Africa region approximately have any penalties for domestic abuse. Only 11% recognize sexual domestic violence as a crime, so marital rape as a crime. So, which basically means that as a woman, if you're married, you have 0 legal protection from rape in many of these countries, which is really quite scary. Only 5% of countries in this region recognize financial abuse as a crime. Financial abuse is just taking away any financial agency, making women completely dependent on the male guardian. Again, robs them of much autonomy, and also just leaves you really, really vulnerable to abuse because there's just nothing you can do about it because you need your abuser to actually survive. So when we look at the legal rights in the Middle East, we look at the legal situation of women in the Middle East, you can see the situation is not fantastic. But what I actually also want to talk about are cultural practices in the Middle East, because as I sort of hinted at earlier, these two things are really strongly related. Laws reflect culture, culture reflects laws. Often, laws can often lag behind culture in authoritarian regimes where, so for example, on human rights classically, most people in authoritarian regimes want the right to free speech, but that may not be reflected in laws. However, oftentimes laws can reflect culture. And as we'll see in a lot of these countries, the restrictive laws on the rights of women in the Middle East are reflective of a deeper societal attitude of patriarchalism and restriction of female autonomy. And we'll also sort of see how, despite lots of progress being made legally and how women having the right to free speech, for example, the right to vote on par with men, that doesn't really reflect any amount of respect that women are accorded in this culture. So as I mentioned before, 37% of women in all Arab countries have experienced domestic abuse. Not too surprising, considering the legal situation of them. 99.3% of women in Egypt have been sexually harassed. In the last 12 months, 29% of Egyptian women have been physically sexually harassed or sexually assaulted. I'm using Egypt because if you remember me saying, Egypt is the country that on the World Values Survey shows the strongest inclination towards survival values. That's not a coincidence. All these things really matter. If you have a society which is pervaded by values of patriarchalism and traditional family authority, and where women are expected to be deferential towards men, and where women are conceptualized in a more explicitly sexual way, where female worth is calibrated more on sexual attractiveness and chastity, and the limitation on female promiscuity and sexuality is a much stronger emphasis in these cultures, this all has real impacts on how people are treated. So in the cities, it's even worse. So 47% of Egyptian or Sudanese women have been sexually harassed in the last year alone. That's nearly 1 in 2, which is really frightening. And in Egypt, again, I'm using Egypt as an example because in all these statistics, Egypt just classically tops the list. It's really one of the worst places for women in the world, although Afghanistan in recent years has taken that title. So in Egypt, 62% of men and 49% of women agree with honor killing. And honor killing is a practice where often not necessarily male relatives, the relatives of the victim will kill them because in more traditional societies, the concept of honor and reputation has a much, much more important bearing in the lives of individuals, which means that members of a family which are perceived to violate that are often subject to violence from their relatives. Now, honor killing, it's not by definition a gendered issue. In practice, a lot of it centers around female promiscuity and disobedience of husbands and disobedience of male guardians, especially within the context of sex and chastity. Again, in more traditional societies, these are issues which clearly preoccupy communal psychology much more than they do in our society. Another thing, in the entire Middle East and North Africa region, 1 in 5 girls are married before the age of 18. A third of all brides in Yemen, for example, are actual children. You can imagine in societies where women's rights and respect for women is already strongly curtailed, you can imagine the power dynamic between men and women that already exists is just amplified massively in the case of an adult versus a minor, a child partner. The fact the age of consent in Iran is 13 and the age of consent in Iraq has now been lowered to 9, I believe. And another cultural practice is female genital mutilation, which there's a lot of disparity actually in the Middle East and North Africa region and in Arabic countries on these. In countries such as Chad, which isn't technically in either, but it's nearby, it's near that cultural sphere, about 9/10 of women have been subjected to forced genital mutilation. Forced marriage is also a really, really big issue in the Middle East and North Africa. It's not legal in these countries, with the exception of Afghanistan. And again, forced marriage. If you are forced to marry someone against your will, who then has sex with you against your will, that is arguably sex slavery. I personally argue. I mean, again, the definition of that is more up in the air. I don't want to force my own opinions down people's heads. I really just want to report statistics and let people form their own opinions. But to me, forced sex does seem like sex slavery. Also, human trafficking. of women and girls. Really, really big issue. There's actually been some anecdotal reports just from journalists on how entire villages on the outskirts of Cairo, for example, the bulk of economic activity is genuinely in just human trafficking of people. Some more information on cultural practice and sort of beliefs on the respect of women and beliefs on violence of women. So in the Middle East and North Africa, lots and lots of people, men and women, interestingly, women as well, think that it's acceptable for domestic violence, so male husbands beating women is acceptable if a woman disobeys the male. And you actually see this pattern in lots of African Islamic countries. So if you poll Christian sub-Saharan African countries, they reveal the same pattern. There's actually been studies kind of showing just what percentage of men and women believe that domestic violence is acceptable for lack of deference to male authority. They're generally pretty high. In Palestine, for example, I know that Palestine is a contentious example. I'm aware. I'm only using it precisely because Palestine features so greatly in international consciousness. There's been more research on it. I'm just using Palestine as an example of a country whose attitudes are probably emblematic of those of the Middle East. So 60% of men and 50% of women either strongly agreed or just agreed that, in quotes, a violent husband is not solely responsible for his behavior because it is caused by his wife and the conditions of his daily life. So 71% of Palestinian men and 64% of Palestinian women also agreed that husbands should have the right to beat their wives, if they think that she's unfaithful. 80% of rural Egyptian women said that husbands should be able to beat wives if they refuse to sleep with him. I think what's actually really illuminating when you look at these studies is the rates of women agreeing with these statements is usually quite similar to the rates of men agreeing with these statements. I think a reflection of, again, in a country where these values and these beliefs are so normalized and where female access to education is so limited and where deference to male authority is so ingrained from the very beginning, I don't actually think it's too surprising that a lot of these norms have been internalized. I also think that it's also the case that the same wider societal factors that impel societies to become more tradition-based or survival-based apply to both men and women. So a really big one is lack of economic development, really strongly correlated. I say really strongly. In statistics, that actually does mean something. I just mean there is a significant correlation between lack of economic development and how conservative a society is. So it's not entirely internalization, but it is obviously going to be that to a large extent. And again, there was also a study on the percentage of women who believe that a husband is justified in beating their wife if she either neglects the kids, burns the food, goes out the house without telling him, argues with him, or refuses to have sex with him. So people will ask this question. So do you believe that a husband is justified in beating their wife in any of these conditions? And in Afghanistan, 80% of women agreed with that. In Iraq, 51% of women agreed with that. In Yemen, 49% of women agreed with that. So again, we can see that the laws about women in these societies are in part a reflection of cultural beliefs on the autonomy and respect given to women. Just some more statistics that I'm going to bring up. So in Afghanistan, as of July 24, 64% of women felt not at all safe being outside versus 2% of men. And again, in countries with disrespect for women ingrained in law and culture, you can imagine that sexual harassment and sexual assault rates are significantly higher. There's also much more normalized in the society. So the fact that 99% of women in Egypt, for example, have been sexually harassed has to be a testament to some degree of normalization for that. And 8% of women in Afghanistan knew one or more women who had attempted suicide in the last 3 years. And this stuff is improving throughout recent years. It's not improving as fast as you might desire. And a lot of feminist activists in this region tend to be jailed or killed by various governments. And again, education is rising. Women's education is rising in some of these countries, but women have no right to education in these countries. And so I just really want to make the point that it's not just, when we talk about women's rights in the Middle East and the status of women in the Middle East, it's not just about legal rights, it's about cultural practice. And another thing, if you look at attitudes towards women in the West, especially women being portrayed as sex objects in media, or sexual harassment or sexual assault being normalized as jokes in media. If you look at the fact that the Me Too movement wasn't enabled by society until very recently, and even then faced a massive amount of backlash. if you look at the prevalence of rape culture in Western society, if you look at the perception of women that you commonly see on more right-wing communities online as owing men sex or owing deference to men, all of these things are really big problems in the West. And these are countries where, if you look at the World Value Survey, are massively more progressive than countries in the African Islamic bubble, and where that's reflected in a much stronger legal status for women. So if all of these things are major problems in Western societies, you can kind of extrapolate what things are going to be like in Middle East and North African societies as well. And another really big thing to talk about is rape is still stigmatized in the West, and lots of women, like the way that rape is prosecuted in the West is still really quite deficient. So, for example, the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK only has a conviction rate of rape for about 10%, I believe, which is really quite poor, especially in some of the cases where there's a lot of evidence as well. So to use Andrew Tate as an example, he allegedly, I say allegedly, raped someone, sent her a voice message claiming how much he enjoyed raping her, and then moved to Romania. Explicitly, he said, because they were more lax about rape prosecution there, but the CPS didn't prosecute it, despite the fact that it was reported. So if these are all problems in the West, extrapolate that to the Middle East and North Africa region. And also, rape stigmatization is a much, much bigger deal there. And the idea of a loss of chastity and a loss of purity, a loss of virtue, is something that women have to deal with along with the trauma of being raped. Like, if your worth as a woman is calibrated in terms of being a virgin at marriage, or it's calibrated in terms of chastity, of lack of sexual relations, the violation of that against your will has this double traumatic effect. Because not only do you have to live with this massive trauma, but you're ostracized and stigmatized by that society. So all of this massive rant is really to say, to answer your original question, which I've just gone on a massive ramble, I'm very sorry, but I'm just very passionate about this sort of issue, is to say the rights of women is not fantastic in the Middle East.
Yeah. I mean, thank you so much for imparting so much knowledge. And I really like that you brought up about the happiness and the needs for happiness, because I think countries like the UK and in the West, we read a lot about these countries, and you can read facts and statistics about legislation, but the fact is that there is no way for us to comprehend that. I'm lucky I've not had to experience life in that country, and the simple fact is if you are living with that restriction of rights, you are unhappy. You aren't going to be able to live your life to the fullest and enjoy freedoms and things. And I think it is really hard for people to grasp that. It's easy to read a statistic and say 50% of women get married at this age or something, but in order for us to actually comprehend that and begin to educate ourselves and be activists and stand up for women all over the world, I think it's really important to remember what if it was you, what would you have stripped away from your life if your life was in one of these countries. So yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up. And what do you think the role of people like you and me in the West sat here, we're talking about it, but fortunately we are not experiencing this. What can we do, and what do you think we should do, if anything?
I mean, for starters, so a lot of the Gulf states in the Middle East and North Africa, who have previously based all their wealth on hydrocarbons, and now starting to shift towards tourism and international sports as a way to improve their income. Yeah. I think it should go without saying not to engage with that. I mean, for example, when Qatar hosted, I think it was the World Cup recently, and Qatar, I mean, all these Gulf states, for example, it's not just oppression of women. They're not great with human rights in general and on political freedoms. There's also a big problem of slavery in these regions. Yeah. So lots of, for example, South Asian workers will migrate to these countries for work and then have their passports confiscated, be crammed into tiny rooms where they cram 5 or 6 people into a room, and then essentially forced to work for poverty wages, which is wage slavery, essentially. So again, it's not just the issue on women. But again, just be very wary. And also, a lot of the sports that you see, I think there's some boxing matches or martial arts matches which are now being bought up by kind of Gulf state companies. I know Saudi Arabia is hosting some boxing stuff. I think, remember, wealth talks. And in the West, despite the fact that obviously many people in the West are not wealthy, disposable income in the West is significantly higher for the average person than it is outside of the West. And the fact that we do have disposable income at all gives us some power to do something about it. Raising awareness as well. And I think pressuring governments to try and, I mean, it's difficult to say because, I mean, the UK government, for example, I mean, they're not exactly going to land an army in the UAE and force women to be respected. But for whatever scope there is of government action, I think awareness of these issues needs to come with agitation for them, with a desire to do what you can, to sign petitions, to raise a kind of societal awareness that reflects on pressures for governments. We do thankfully live in a democracy. And I mean, in fairness, our representatives aren't always responsive to what we actually want, but the more societal tension there is against these issues, the more likely it is that some kind of government action can be taken, whatever that manifests itself as. So yeah, I think it's also important to, I think despite the fact that these countries are Muslim, I think it's important not to sink into Islamophobia.
Yeah.
I think actually just a word on that. So if you look at the African Islamic bubble, sort of cultural bubble of countries in the bottom left corner of the cultural map of the world, they're not just Islamic countries, they're Christian countries as well. The point isn't Islam. It's not as if Islam is some particularly violent religion compared to Christianity. If you read the Old Testament, there's multiple references to genocide, often sanctioned by God. Genocides against the Midianites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Canaanites, all the ites, many ites were not doing too well in this period. There's lots of, I mean, slavery is explicitly condoned, quite brutal patriarchy. I mean, Deuteronomy, for example, says that women can be stoned to death if she's not found to be a virgin on her wedding night. It's the Abrahamic faiths in general the Abrahamic holy books were written at a very, very different time to our own. They reflect political and moral values very, very different to their own. The Quran, for example, was written in the 7th century AD. It's a mirror of the values of that society. Same with the Old Testament. I think for Christianity, for example, the Western world is one of a Christian heritage, but we don't follow the political moral values of the Old Testament anymore. I think that's the more important factor here. It's not Christianity itself that's the problem. A lot of people are Christians and use it for spiritual guidance. It can involve political beliefs, and that can have detrimental consequences. For example, the repeal of Roe versus Wade was quite religiously motivated, and the result of that has been tens of thousands of rape-related pregnancy in the southern United States, which I can only imagine as being a horribly traumatic event. But many Christians in the West also don't believe that religion should have an impact on politics, and they believe it should be a matter of personal faith. Personal faith. And I think that's the key factor here. It's not, if you interpret these religions in such a way that you ignore the fundamentalist interpretation of them and you interpret them in a way that fits the moral values of your society and political values of your society. So, for example, Reform Judaism or progressive sects of Christianity really adopt the political and moral values of the modern Western world, and then they interpret Christian scripture to fit that. That's one thing. The harmful effects come from when, instead of doing that, you go the other way and you use texts written by societies centuries or millennia in the past to inform political practice and moral beliefs now. And I think that just the point here to mention is that Islam itself is not the problem. It's the application of Islam to politics that caused the problem. So Islamism, which is the political ideology of Islam. In the same way, Christianity in the West isn't really a fundamental problem, but fundamentalist Christianity, which seeks to undo the kind of centuries-long practice of the separation between religion and state in the Western world. So, for example, I think Betsy DeVos, a member of Trump's cabinet in his first term, wanted to teach creationism in schools. That's an example of that. Or I think she also wanted to have the 10 Commandments engraved in law courts. I mean, the repeal of Roe versus Wade is another example. The application of any Abrahamic faith, of any faith affecting previous values to modern society can be dangerous. It's not just Islam. We can actually see in sub-Saharan African Christian countries, views on women. So these statistics that I've just mentioned about rates of justified, normalized domestic violence, they're similar, if not higher, in Christian sub-Saharan African countries. It's not the religion itself, it's the way that it's used.
Yeah. And I think I like what you're trying to say is for people, for example, in the West who are reading these headlines or seeing this news about legislation stuff, it's important that we, number one, are angry about it and, like you said, are pushing our representatives and ourselves to be outraged and to stand up for these women. And also, I think what you're trying to say is it's important not just to kind of see the news or hear about this and not educate yourself further as well, because I think, like you said, it's very easy. A lot of miseducation and Islamophobia in the UK comes from seeing these headlines about, say, a law that prohibits women from doing something that she would be allowed to do in the UK in one of these countries, and that then being instantly equated to Islam's bad. It's a lack of education and a lack of nuance in people's opinions and ideas that is like creating such a big problem, and then that just makes it 10 times worse for actual progression and for people to stand up for women's rights in these countries. So I really like what you said about that, and it's important to recognize that nowhere is perfect, and you shouldn't glorify places like the UK or US where women seemingly do have more rights, because obviously they don't. Like you say, Roe v. Wade, prosecution of rapists in the UK, it's not good. None of it's good, and obviously it is worse in the Middle East. I think it's important that feminists are intersectional and recognize that the fight for women's rights is not just a selfish one, but one for every woman, and one in which no woman is free until they all are. And I think I'm really glad that you brought those things up. Is there any other statistics or anything else that you wanted to speak about on today's podcast?
Not a statistic, but I think just to return to the religious thing again, I mean, if you look at the Bible, for example, with these texts, it really just depends how you interpret it. And I think actually some policymakers just kind of suggest using some quotations of the Quran to encourage a better treatment of women in these societies. Because, for example, the Bible says, on the one hand, there's a quote that says, a woman should not be allowed to speak in church. There's another quote that says, love thy neighbor, And it really, with the Bible, most people haven't read these religious texts. Yeah. They're aware of their importance, they acknowledge them as a source of legitimacy. But really, the quotes that are presented to them and the way that they're framed can be used to support changes in political and moral beliefs. And actually in the 1800s, so reformers in the 1800s who were trying to get kids out of chimneys and people to stop working 16 hours a day and being paid poverty wages often used Christianity as a progressive force. I think with Islam, that also can be done. And there are quotes in the Quran, there are quotes in the Quran which talk about male authority over women and deference in general. There are also quotes in the Quran which can be interpreted in a more progressive way. And just as with the Bible, the Bible could be used to support a progressive agenda. So, for example, actually Christian communism is a thing where it's like a branch of communism where the teachings of Jesus Christ are used to justify very left-wing progressive policies. That process of interpretation can be applied to any holy text, and it can be applied to Islam as well. And it's possible that the way forth could be, it's not necessarily a case of forsaking Islam, it's just a strong idea of taking Islam out of politics and taking Abrahamic religions out of politics in general. But Islam can actually be used as a force to bolster those progressive values. And there are some quotes in the Quran about how women should be respected and treated well. So, that's me.
Well, thank you so much. And I just wanted to say as well, is there anything you would recommend listeners could do to educate themselves? You're clearly very knowledgeable about the topic. Is there any particular book, podcast, news outlet that you use when you're learning about it? How do you stay informed, and how do you find information that you feel is non-biased and factual?
I think United Nations reports are a really good place to start. I do genuinely trust the United Nations statistics when they give statistics on this kind of thing. And also, what I especially trust is the methodology of it. Because with scientific studies, the phrase a scientific study, that confers legitimacy to a lot of people. They'll be like, there's a study about this. Lots of studies are kind of bullshit. And they're just not conducted in proper ways. You often see this with fad diets will wheel out a study, and you look at that study, and it'll just be the worst, the most useless piece of literature ever. But United Nations studies are really good. Yeah. So if you just look at United Nations reports on treatment of women in the Middle East, domestic violence rates, domestic abuse laws, all this kind of stuff, very important, very useful. I think another source of information I get, there's some books that I've read about, I'm trying to remember what they're called. I'll try and text it to you after, just about the status of kind of women's rights around the world, especially say in the Middle East. A lot of, I think scientific articles can be useful when they're useful. Sorry, they can be useful as well when they're well conducted. So there's a big database called PubMed, PUBMED. You need to just Google search it, and it's just a big. It's like a just a website with loads of scientific papers, and they're scientific papers both on the natural sciences and the hard sciences, but also on this kind of stuff. So the information that I've gotten about how justified people, so what percentage of people think it's justified for men to beat their wives if, for example, they refuse to have sex with them, that study was actually listed in PubMed. That's where I found it. And if you go and PubMed's really good because the papers in it tend to be pretty reliable. I recommend when going down the route of looking at scientific papers, look at many of them just so you kind of get an idea of what they're all saying in relation to each other. A really good way to start is also to look at reviews. So if you go on PubMed, loads of scientific articles will have the word review in their title, or they'll be kind of labeled or tagged as a review. A review is just like, it's like looking over at lots of different studies to see what's going on. I also, just a bit of a shameless plug that I'm going to give here, because you mentioned the word podcast, and I feel, I do actually talk about this on my podcast. Yes. It's a bit annoying of me to promote my own stuff on this, and I am sorry. But I do talk about this, especially on, I have an educational podcast on Spotify and YouTube called Polymath, where I talk about that process of how, first of all, how the Western world detached itself from bringing politics from involving religion and politics. And I also, for example, in episode 20, when I talk about what life was like in the past, I talk about what life is like in the past for women, and I also compare that with what life is like for women now, and how especially in regions like the Middle East and North Africa, and how more traditional regions, there's not as much of a difference between the way that women have been treated historically and the way that they're treated now. There's not been that much change. But if you just go on that episode on Spotify and YouTube, there's more information about that there. And if you want to learn about happiness, what people need for happiness, and to try and compare that to what's going on now, I have actually also done another podcast. I just can't get enough of yapping, clearly, on happiness. It's also on Spotify and YouTube. It's called Understanding Happiness, Science and the Buddha. And I just talk about the scientific study of happiness and how it also kind of overlaps with with what lots of different philosophies and belief systems say about happiness as well. And you can read that and kind of get a better idea of what I'm talking about, and a better idea of the kind of harm that's inflicted on women as a result of these policies and the cultural practices that we see in the world today.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Thank you so much. I think what you're trying to say there as well is it's important when you are educating yourself on a topic, not just look at the first thing you see, or it's very easy. I think a lot of people inform themselves through social media, which can be a very good or a very bad thing. And I think it's important, like you say, to look at things like PubMed, where you can look at reviews and look at lots of different sources. And like you say, even today, you've spoken about statistics rather than your own opinions. And I think it's really helpful, because I think the worst tensions that can come up between people, especially even just in the UK amongst different groups of people, is this lack of like understanding and lack of education and lack of understanding someone else's culture or someone else's country. And I think it's really important that people put the work in and read these surveys, read these reviews and statistics, and form their own opinions. And thank you so much for.
Can I say one more
thing?
Yes,
of course.
I'm so sorry. I think especially with social media, I just think also bear in mind, social media companies want you to be engaged and they want you to be angry. So they're going to feed you content which aligns with what you already think, what you already know, and which is designed to sort of get you angry, because anger is engagement.
Yeah.
I'd recommend just looking at newspapers and news sources of the other side of the political divide. You don't have to agree with them. You can think that they're stupid, you can think that they're wrong, but just do it anyway. So if you're, for example, right wing, read The Guardian. If you're left wing, dare I say, read the Daily Mail. I don't personally have much faith in the journalistic stand of it. And again, you can read it if only to disparage it. You can read it just to confirm to yourself, this is poor journalism and it's biased and it's incorrect. But it's worth doing so anyway, just to get an idea of not just, I guess, other interpretations of what you're seeing, but statistics and facts which the news articles that you read might omit. Because lots of newspapers won't outright lie, but they will miss out information that gives a more balanced perspective. And in any case, even if you don't agree with it, even if, for example, you read the Daily Mail and you're like, well, this has no meaning to me, whatever, at least it's some kind of indication of how other people are thinking. Yeah. Because that is how other people are thinking. And I think it's inherently valuable to understand the psychology of other people. Sorry, I just wanted to say
No,
that
no,
just
I
at the
think
end
that's
there.
also an important. I think it's like when people debate and they have to debate on the other side. I think it's important that people learn about the views that they don't align with as well, in order to make for sort of nuanced and sophisticated ideas, and
Mm,
like reaching policy agreements in places in like the sphere of like politics. I think it's important that people are educated on each side, and there's not this sort of like black and white tension and friction between two
mm.
sides. So I think that's a really important point. If you do text me the books, I can also link
Yes.
them
Yeah.
and your podcast in the description. And yeah, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Is there anything else that you'd like to say today?
Um, yeah, actually, on further reflection, if you do want to read a right wing newspaper, that's very admirable. Maybe read a better one than the Daily Mail. But I just use it as an example because what came to mind. Maybe pick a better one. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No,
I'm
thank you
really
so
grateful to be
much.
here.
Thank you so much. And thank you for listening to the Live Global Reef podcast. We will be back again soon, and feel free to leave us a review if you enjoyed this episode. Thank you.